In the first lesson we talked about player one advantage. Uh, let's say that you decide I don't care about player one. I just don't want to give my opponent a big advantage in terms of team quality, right? So in that case, what you want to do is pick a matchup that is as even as it can get, right? So how do we do that? There's only 12 teams. They don't necessarily fit neatly into like a tier structure. There have been some attempts to do that. They're not terrible, but a lot of this is subjective for how you like to play, what you're good at, right? So it doesn't necessarily lend itself perfectly to a tier system. So instead, we're going to make this political, and we're going to try and organize these teams by socioeconomic status. All right. We start, and I actually have them kind of arranged here on the screen that you can hopefully see in their various groups. Starting with the elites, right? The tippy top. Chicago, I think they're pretty clearly a number one, especially in tournament play, right? They have so many advantages, so many, more than any other team, I think. Maybe not every one of their advantages is not necessarily the biggest in the game. Like, I'm not sure there's a bigger advantage than having both Lawrence Taylor and Carl Banks on your defense, right? That's crazy good. But Chicago has so much else, right? And more than that, they're very user friendly. Like, you could take a tribesman from an uncontacted people in the forest and give him 2 days to get ready. And if he only had to use Chicago, he would do all right in a tournament. They're very user friendly, right? But as I noted, the New York defense with LT and Carl Banks is more than capable of going toe to toe with Chicago and dominating them. It's happened a bunch of times, right? New York does not have a great offense, but it's a decent offense, right? It's enough if your defense is really bringing it and Chicago is struggling to move the ball. And then you also look at San Francisco with the collection of firepower. Offensively, they've got Joe Montana, they've got Jerry Rice. Roger Craig, the receiver, is awesome. Roger Craig, the running back, sucks, right? But he also goes out for 2 passes. And with his speed characteristics, putting the ball in his hands across the line of scrimmage with room to make a move, he is a first down machine, right? That's a lot of offensive firepower. And then defensively, they got Ronnie Lott. And it doesn't get much better than that. So San Fran has the firepower to go toe-to-toe with Chicago and beat them, particularly in a cheap viewers. Oh, spam. Marvelous. In a one-off tournament game situation. San Fran really is a good team. Its playbook in our draft league has certainly gone through its foibles, right? But I think the whole package of San Francisco is so overpowering that it does rescue an underwhelming playbook. What's up, Chris? Hope you're having a good one, buddy. Right now we're talking about like matchups. So you've got these 3 teams that kind of sit above everybody else. So a matchup involving any 2 of Chicago, New York, and San Francisco, I think you could consider that a fairly even matchup. Now we're going to get to the meat of the Tecmo Bowl tournament scene, what I call the Tecmo Bowl middle class. Denver, Seattle, Indy, and Cleveland. These teams, there's a good talent spread among all of them, but not as much as any of the best teams, and each of these squads have flaws, right? But Denver and Seattle, that's an Omaha Classic. That would be my guess, as the most called matchup in tournament history over the years, because those are the 2 most evenly matched teams. They're very similar. But on the other hand, you look at like Indy and Cleveland, that's another common matchup. Those 2 teams, unlike Denver and Seattle, who are like mirrors of each other, Indy and Cleveland's that's more of like a yin-yang, where their strengths and weaknesses complement each other and kind of cancel each other out. They are oddly balanced in that regard. Just for example, Indy does not have a very fast defense, But Cleveland's got one of the worst running backs in the game, or one of the slowest anyway. Meanwhile, Indy has a great running back, but Cleveland has tremendous speed in their secondary, right? So like weakness cancels out weakness, strength cancels out strength. So those four teams all match up pretty well together, right? And you'd be well served to be familiar with each of those teams, because you can only call the same matchup once in group play and then once again in brackets. So if you find yourself on the spot, we're well in the tournament, we've been there all day, you're not thinking so great, right? You win a coin toss in brackets. You want to know each of these teams so that if need be, you can just throw out Cleveland, Denver, and be confident playing with either one of those teams. All right? Below the middle class, we've got what I'm going to call the working poor. Here we've got Miami, Dallas, and LA. May seem crazy to see teams like LA and Miami down here in the working poor. However, the flaws in their playbook are what keep them down, and also like pretty crummy defenses compared to what's above them. Like, you know, we all love Howie Long. We love Howie, but I'd love him a lot more if he was a top D end. He doesn't quite have enough speed to get to the top on quick throws. And then when he tries, he's very easy to throw behind. So we'd love Howie even more if he was a top D end. But Miami, Dallas, LA, working poor. What they have in common is their offenses are better than their defenses. Miami has great QB, a couple okay receivers, not much else, right? Dallas has Herschel. And LA has a ton of offensive talent, a bad quarterback, but a crummy playbook that is pretty easy to exploit. And just to touch on that real briefly, there's no top wide receiver, so there's no one to top the top outside linebacker. He's always unblocked, no matter what gets called, right? And so that means that the defense can kind of squat over on offense and just do what they can to limit the ground game and set LA up for play picks and third and long situations. It's no bueno. So the biggest flaw with all of these teams is the defenses, right? Like, it's not a lot of fun to have to defend against like John Elway with the Dallas defense. That sucks, right? So these defenses are going to be lacking, and that is going to hold them back in matchups with the middle class, which is why I put them on a lower rung. Finally, we've got the Hobos, Washington, and Minnesota. Two perfectly fun and interesting rosters that are completely torpedoed by the wide receiver reverse. Teams basic, and once you know the deal with how to defend those, the other team pretty much never has to call run. It's very difficult for those teams to sustain drives. Well, Chris, we've seen in the draft league, it's a very good playbook with 2 runs. O.J. Robinson 2 runs, though. So that's why those guys, Washington and Minnesota, are both talented teams. Washington for sure would be top half. I think they were intended to be very good. You can tell just by the talent on their roster. But the playbook as it is, these are not good teams. But incidentally, Washington, Minnesota that's a tournament viable matchup. Now, I'm thinking a lot about how to work some of these lower teams into my matchmaking calls. I don't know if I'm going to do it. Last year I did worse than I ever had before, and I was calling a lot of good teams, and I'm just going to move. I'm going to move away from that. That's just me, though. I think a lot of people are more comfortable with the really good teams. I feel like my game knowledge gives me an advantage if we're using worse teams. So that's what I'll be thinking about going into Omaha. So that is basically when you think about these groups: the elites, the middle class, the working poor, and the hobos. Matchups among those groups you can generally consider to be pretty even matchups, right? That's lesson 2. Lesson 3, we're going to look at what you could call like asymmetrical match calling, right? Where you call 2 teams that aren't even with the idea being that you're either going to wind up with player one or you're going to wind up with the better team.